and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 6 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled Victory of the Faith. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the delay with this episode. As I was revising the script for the final part of this series, I realized it would be best if I split it into 2 parts. Then, while I was working on the revisions, I got distracted with school, and I got sick, which delayed things even more, and then at a certain point I decided it'd be best to release both parts at roughly the same time. So this part, episode 6, should come out late on Saturday, April 11th, with part 7 coming out the next day, April 12th. Both will be backdated for continuity purposes, but if you're listening to this already, I'm assuming you've already figured that out. Additionally, the first episode of the new series on the crisis of the 3rd century should come out sometime this week. Again, apologies for the delay, and without further ado, let's begin. In the previous episode of our series on the Iron Guard, we covered events from about December 1937 to September 1940. This was a time of tribulations for the Legion of the Archangel Michael, as the Iron Guard was formerly known. Outlawed for much of its existence, restrictions on the Legion were lifted in 1934, and government repression of the movement more or less ceased. During this time, the Legion was able to engage in mostly peaceful, constructive activities that improved its public image and massively grew in popularity as a result. However, their fortunes took a turn for the worse towards the end of the year 1937. Romania's king, Carol II, after failing to subordinate the Legion to his authority, decided to eradicate the organization entirely. The Legion was effectively banned from campaigning for that year's general election, but made an impressive showing nonetheless, winning over 15% of the vote. As there was no clear victor overall, the king decided to bring the National Christian Party, led by Octavian Goga and Professor Alexandru Cuza, into government. This government, led by Goga and Cuza, was ultimately quite short-lived, and within a month and a half, the king dissolved it and established in its place a royal dictatorship. Now free to act against the Legion, Carol ordered the arrests of several senior leaders of the organization, including the captain Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu. From prison, Codreanu instructed the Legionaries to not engage in violent resistance against the government, as this would only provoke more severe repression. Many members of the Legion therefore went into hiding, disappearing among the mountains and forests of rural Transylvania. Some opted to flee the country entirely. Meanwhile, Codreanu was put on trial for treason and was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. It is speculated that part of the reason why Codreanu made no effort to resist government repression is because he believed that the rapidly shifting geopolitical conditions in Europe would make the situation more favorable for himself and the Legion. Specifically, he saw the ascendancy of Germany as an ill portent for the longevity of Carol II and his regime, as the king favored the Western Allies, that is to say France and the UK. And while Codreanu was correct in assuming that international developments would ultimately be Carol's undoing, he would not live long enough to see this eventuality. After the Legion's leadership was effectively decapitated by the king, the organization was left rudderless for a time. Eventually, power fell to one Horia Sima, a relatively minor figure in the Legion's hierarchy prior to 1938. His obscurity had actually worked to his advantage, as he was unknown to the authorities and thus able to escape to Berlin, where he established a headquarters for the Legion in exile. From Germany, Sima directed members of the Legion still in Romania to carry out terrorist attacks against their enemies, namely Jews and law enforcement. This was very much against the wishes of the captain, who feared that the recrimination for these actions would fall upon himself and the others in prison. In fact, the king was still quite concerned with Codreanu's subversive potential, despite his imprisonment. So, on the night of November 30th, 1938, the captain was taken from his cell, driven out into a remote forest, and shot. The Legion held the king and his newly appointed prime minister, Armand Călinescu, responsible for the captain's death. Less than a year later, on September 21st, an Iron Guard death squad ambushed Călinescu's automobile on the streets of Bucharest and shot him to death. They then took over a nearby radio station to announce their deed over the airwaves, after which they were apprehended by the authorities and executed on the spot. The cycle of violence and retribution continued to play out in a similar manner until about May of 1940. By this point in time, it was becoming apparent to all that Germany was ascendant in Europe. Deciding that rapprochement with Germany was the best course of action, Carol decided to embrace fascism in a more outward manner, rebranding his political party, the National Renaissance Front, into an avowedly totalitarian one. At the same time, Carol began to rehabilitate the Iron Guard. The ban on the organization was lifted, and gradually members of the Legion who had gone into exile or hiding began to re-emerge. At the invitation of the king, a few legionaries were offered positions in the cabinet. Recently returned from Germany, Horia Sima was appointed as the Minister of Culture and Religious Affairs. Slight correction from the previous episode, where I mistakenly said that he was made the Minister of Education. In any event, Sima was compelled to resign from this office after less than a week, in large part due to the criticism directed at him from the ranks of the Legion for collaborating with the king. Then, in the summer of 1940, the Romanian nation faced two successive crises that assured the ultimate demise of the royal dictatorship. In late June, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to Romania, demanding that it cede the border regions of Moldavia and northern Bukovina or face war. Carol complied and ordered his armed forces to evacuate the aforementioned territories without offering any resistance. This action in turn emboldened Romania's other neighbors, mainly Hungary, to press their claims to Romania's territory. The Romanians appealed to the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, to arbitrate this dispute. After several days of tense negotiations, the Axis diplomats mandated that Romania cede northern Transylvania, a territory of 43,492 square kilometers, or 16,792 square miles, and a population of 2,667,000 people to Hungary. Under normal circumstances, the Romanian government would never have accepted these terms. The Romanian delegate, Foreign Minister Mihail Maniolescu, allegedly fainted when shown a map of the proposed partition boundaries. But these were not normal circumstances, and there was little choice but to sign the agreement. These losses, both to Hungary and to the Soviet Union, amounted to about one-third of Romania's territory. The king's remaining popularity was absolutely destroyed. Mass protests broke out in the streets of the capital, calling for his immediate abdication. The entire country appeared to be on the verge of revolution. Carol saw the writing on the wall and abdicated the throne on September 5, 1940. He then, along with his longtime mistress Elena Lupescu, fled the country, taking most of the contents of the national treasury along with them. Carol was succeeded as king by his 18-year-old son, Michael. Michael I would remain Romania's legal head of state until the abolition of the monarchy in 1947. However, he spent the majority of his reign relegated to the position of a powerless figurehead. Carol's final act prior to abdication was to appoint General Ion Antonescu as the prime minister and invest him with his wide-ranging executive powers. Conversely, in the first week of his reign, King Michael issued a royal decree number 3053 specifically, confirming Antonescu's position as conjugator, or leader of the Romanian state. A concurrent decree, Royal Decree number 3052, repealed the Constitution of 1938, the document by which Carol II had instituted his royal dictatorship, and suspended Parliament for an indefinite period. Although his decision to elevate Antonescu to power was ultimately his undoing, Carol had done so in the first place because the general was thought to be singularly capable of resolving the ongoing political crisis. He had some level of cachet with all the major political parties, including the Iron Guard. His ties with the Legion dated back as far as 1936, when Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu met with him to discuss electoral strategy. Allegedly, the general found the captain to be somewhat arrogant personally, but he nonetheless sympathized with his political views. Over time, the two men became somewhat close, with Antonescu serving as a valuable contact for Codreanu within the government. Antonescu even stuck out his neck to testify on Codreanu's behalf during his trial in 1938, but to little avail. The general further aroused the king's ire in the summer of 1940, when he sent a letter to Carol harshly criticizing him for ceding the nation's territory without resistance. As a consequence, he was arrested and interned at a monastery in Moldavia. Evidently, his captors did not watch him too closely, as during this time Antonescu was able to establish contact with the German Foreign Office, pledging to support Germany's interests in Romania in exchange for their backing once he came to power. For their part, the Germans, particularly their ambassador to Romania, Wilhelm Fabricius, had reservations about Antonescu. His ties with France, he had previously served as a military attaché to the country, were a cause for concern. The avowedly pro-Axis Iron Guard, some thought, might prove more loyal allies. At the same time, there were serious doubts as to whether the Iron Guard was capable of ruling on its own. and since Antonescu and the Guard were still closely aligned, the Germans therefore saw no issue in backing the general. Therefore, at the time of his ascension to power, General Antonescu was supported domestically by all the major political parties, the country's elite, and, to an extent, the army, as well as by Germany, whose dominion over Europe was reaching its zenith. In the previous episode, I concluded the narrative with Antonescu agreeing to share power with the Legion, an agreement formalized by the establishment of the National Legionary State on September 14, 1940. While this may seem like the logical course of events to us in retrospect, at the time it was not quite as clear what course of action Antonescu would take. While his affiliation with the Legion was widely known, he did not possess an ideological commitment to fascism, nor did he think very highly of the Legion's current leadership. Strictly speaking, he was under no obligation to ally with the Legion. However, the general could not, at least at the current moment, stabilize the country without the help of some sort of popular political movement, and seeing as how all the alternative governing partners were not viable for one reason or another, the Legion, despite its weakened state, was as popular as it had ever been. Horia Sima used the occasion of the late captain's birthday, September 13th, to demonstrate this fact. That day, the streets of Bucharest were flooded with legionaries and their supporters, dressed in their distinctive green shirts and singing nationalist hymns. Everywhere one turned, one saw signs and posters bearing a stylized image of the captain's face, accompanied by the caption, Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, present, in other words, still alive. It was probably not a coincidence, then, that the next day was when King Michael, at the direction of General Antonescu, proclaimed the foundation of the National Legionary State, which again formalized the power-sharing arrangement between the Conjugator and the Legion. Antonescu later justified this decision by stating that the Legion, quote, represented the political base of the country at that time, end quote. Officially, the Legion was to be more than just the ruling party. In fact, it was to be the only legally permitted party in the entire country, thereby completing Romania's transformation into a totalitarian state, in theory if not in practice. It was to be, to paraphrase the declaration of September 14th, quote, the establishment of a new regime, with the mandate to achieve the salvation of the state and the nation, end quote. General Antonescu, the Conjugator, remained the de facto head of state, while Horia Sima, commandant of the guard, became his second in command. The title of Sima's office varies between the sources, reported alternatively as Vice Premier, Vice Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, or Vice President of the Council of Ministers. While I believe that final title is the closest to the official one, I'll use either Vice Premier or Vice Prime Minister to refer to Sima going forward. Additionally, 5 Gardists were given cabinet-level offices at Sima's request. They were as follows: Mihai Sturza as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Traian Brăileanu as Minister of Education, Arts, and Religious Affairs, Vasil Ianishi as Minister of Labor, Nichifor Krainic as Minister of the Press and Propaganda, and Constantin Papanats as Minister of Finance. Gardists were also appointed to 5 undersecretary positions and several other directorships within government ministries. The Legion was more successful at establishing control at a local level, as all but one of the 45 county prefects were legionaries. During the week between Carol's abdication and the invitation of the Legion into government, Antonescu met frequently with German officials, who advised him to avoid giving his future governing partners control over any ministries deemed crucial to the continued functioning of the economy and the military. He complied with this directive for the most part, filling these offices with men who were loyal to him directly. There was only one major oversight in this regard, that being the appointment of Constantin Petroviescu to the office of Minister of the Interior. Petroviescu was a career army officer who had previously served as a judge on Bucharest's military tribunal, and in fact it was in this capacity that he prosecuted the case against Codreanu and the assassins of Prime Minister Ion Duca in 1934. Petroviescu had since become a fully devoted member of the Guard, a fact that he had evidently managed to keep hidden for some time. His actions once in office, though, left no questions as to where his allegiance lay. He played a critical part in organizing the Legionary Police, a separate law enforcement structure that existed parallel to the state police under the aegis of the Interior Ministry. The Legionary Police functioned essentially as the armed wing of the party, and as such they were far more preoccupied with enacting violence against the Legion's enemies than with maintaining public order. I'll elaborate on this a little further on, but what I'll say for the purpose of this current discussion is that the Legion deemed the creation of a parallel police force entirely beholden to the party as necessary, because the state police forces remained largely resistant to legionary infiltration. The same was true of the military, especially among the officer corps. They were skeptical of the legionary movement, regarding it as a subversive element within Romanian society. With all that being said, one should be able to see that the structure of the so-called National Legionary State was more complex than the label of one-party totalitarian state would suggest. Under a functional totalitarian system, there would have been a complete unification of party and state, and while this may have been the main goal of the new order's proponents, it never came to fruition. There was a division within the regime from the very beginning, and a rather stark one. On one side was Horia Sima and the increasingly fanatical Iron Guard, and on the other was General Antonescu, along with his clique of military officers, industrialists, and technocrats. As historian Ion Antonescu writes in his book, The Legionary Movement After Cornelieu Codreanu, quote, "The term legionary dictatorship chosen by historians is not the best to define the nature of the National Legionary State. In the period between September 1940 and January 1941, the legionary element of the government was not strong enough to define the regime. To use this expression would be to ignore certain functioning features of the regime. General Antonescu and the legionaries were constantly competing with one another to seize the reins of power, but neither was able to gain complete control over the administration." End quote. An open rupture between the two opposing factions was inevitable. As historian Constantin Iourdachi succinctly put it, quote, "The final confrontation was a matter of when, rather than if." End quote. To return our focus back to the weeks immediately following Carol's abdication, no one was yet entertaining thoughts of the violent implosion of the new order. A heady atmosphere pervaded the country, something akin to a religious revival. Antonescu declared the next Sunday, September 8th, to be a national day of atonement. On that day, at noon, church bells across the country were to ring out, and all Romanians, wherever they may be, were instructed to kneel and pray that the country's grave sins may be forgiven. A week later, just a day after the proclamation of the National Legionary State, Helen, the Queen Mother, returned from her exile in Italy at the invitation of General Antonescu. Historian Nicholas Nagy Talavera describes the circumstances of her return as greatly contributing in lifting the spirits of the humiliated nation. Quote, "Queen Helen, the mistreated ex-wife of Carol, who lived in the hearts of the Romanian people as the bearer of the cross, an antipode to the detested Madame Lupescu, who was the personification of Jewish evil, returned to Bucharest amid great pomp and rejoicing to assume her place at the side of her son, King Michael. The bells of the capital's numerous churches tolled solemnly, as the peasants, green shirts, and soldiers all saluted the Regina Mama." End quote. I should note that public displays of reverence towards the royal family, such as this, were arranged by Antonescu not out of any genuine devotion to the monarchy, but to confer legitimacy on his own rule. The Legion and their supporters celebrated their ascent to power in their usual manner, marching through the streets and singing hymns and whatnot. A series of public celebrations were organized by the Legion through September into October, culminating in a massive rally in Bucharest on October 6th. Antonescu, who was already starting to maintain some distance from the Legion's own affairs, nonetheless made an appearance alongside Sima at this event, even dressing in a legionary uniform for the occasion. Writing about these festivities, Nagy Talavera made note of one ominous portend. Quote, "In the square beneath the Parliament building and the Palace of the Patriarchate, amid the colorful cavalcade of army uniforms, peasant costumes, and green shirts, there was but one discordant element. A large aggregation of relatives of slain legionaries dressed all in black. They were still in mourning because their loved ones had not yet been avenged." End quote. And so, in the autumn of 1940, with the anxious eyes of the Romanian people looking towards them for salvation, the Iron Guard set out to fulfill the mission of the national revolution. The Legion of the Archangel Michael may have finally risen to the heights of power, but the organization could hardly have been less prepared to exercise their newfound power effectively. The simple fact of the matter was that the version of the Legion that came to power in 1940 was, to paraphrase Ion Antonescu, quote, "only a pale shadow of the organization it had been only 2 years earlier." End quote. Not to put too fine a point on it, But between 1938 and 1940, the royal dictatorship had been incredibly effective in repressing the movement, so much so that some historians argue that the Legion effectively ceased to exist as a viable political organization. German historian Armin Heinen writes, quote, "Under the shock of rigorous state oppression, the legionary movement was dismembered, what remained from it representing only a small terrorist organization of individual cadres." End quote. Said cadres were, due to the decentralized organizational structure of the Legion, isolated from each other and from leadership. This worked to their advantage while they were waging a clandestine insurgency, but suddenly elevated to power, this made it exceedingly difficult to coordinate activities at a national level, hence why the Legion was successful in asserting control over nearly all of the county prefectures, but was forced to share executive power with the military. Moreover, these individual cadres that had survived the Great Persecution consisted primarily of newcomers, hastily recruited and directed to carry out terrorist attacks against the state without undergoing much training, if any. These men were not lacking in zeal, but they had no political experience that would lend itself to governance. The same was true of the central leadership. Practically all of the Legion's first generation of leaders had been wiped out, with the captain only being the most notable example. Again, while the matter of his succession had never been seriously discussed, most of the men who may have proven to be more capable leaders than Sima were arrested around the same time and executed in retribution for the assassination of Prime Minister Călinescu. All of the Legion's most promising figures, according to one joke supposedly popular at the time, were like potatoes, buried in the earth. The man who did eventually fill the void left behind by Codreanu, Horia Sima, was deficient in the qualities that had made the captain such an effective leader. He lacked his charisma, his intelligence, and his patience. What Sima did have was a strong personal ambition, intense religious fanaticism, a lack of scruples when it came to violence, and a penchant for being in the right place at the right time. A report by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, characterized Sima as, quote, "an enthusiast, a fanatic for whom dry reality is inconceivable," end quote. As with the group as a whole, Sima was well suited to lead a clandestine terrorist network, but wholly unprepared to take on the responsibilities of governance. Sima's ascendancy was not a certain outcome, however. He had been able to establish himself as the leader of the organization through a combination of luck and foreign, read German, assistance. Still, in late 1940, there were at least two other factions within the Legion contesting his authority. The most prominent of these factions was led by the late captain's father, Ion Zelea Codreanu. His dispute with Sima appears to have been based on personal enmity rather than any substantive disagreements regarding ideology or tactics. He is said to have described Sima as, quote, "a Satan, in whom the soul of Stelescu still lives," end quote. I've had a difficult time trying to ascertain exactly why the two despised each other. A couple authors have suggested that the elder Codreanu suspected that Sima was some kind of double agent, but I can't say for certain. There was also a faction centered around the Mota Marin Corps, which, as you'll recall, was an elite formation of the Iron Guard founded to commemorate the martyrs Ion Mota and Vasil Marin. Not much information exists about this particular faction either, save for a vague statement that they sought to strengthen the religious character of the movement. In the span of just a few weeks, the Iron Guard went from an outlawed underground movement to a ruling party. This would have been a difficult transition to make even under the best of circumstances. Taking power had been the goal of the Legionary movement from its inception, but its founder, Codreanu, did not wish to make a bid for power until such time as he deemed the organization strong enough and prepared to govern. Indeed, the ability of the Legion to govern effectively was dubious at best, as we've already discussed. Sima, however, dismissed any such criticism out of hand, stating simply, quote, "we have proven that we are strong enough," end quote. Responding to inquiries regarding the Legion's agenda now that they were in power, Sima replied, quote, "our program is not yet worked out, but there is the will to convert principles into deeds," end quote. Practically speaking, the Legion spent this earliest phase of its rule attempting to enact vengeance on those they deemed responsible for their persecution. After all, this had been a semi-official objective of the movement since the publication of the Nest Leader's Manual in 1933. In it, Codreanu outlined a plan to systematically punish so-called enemies of the nation upon taking power. Quote, The first day after the Legion's victory, an exceptional tribunal will be established to summon and put to trial for betrayal of the fatherland all plunderers of public property, all those who have accepted bribes to facilitate business, and all those who, violating the fundamental laws of the country, have persecuted, imprisoned, or damaged legionaries or their families. Whatever position they may hold from gendarme to minister, no one will escape this judgment." End quote. He concluded by stressing the existential importance that this retribution would have to the rebirth of the nation. Quote, "The Romanian nation, aware of its own rights, will start the new life by legal punishment. We are patiently waiting for this moment. Without this moment of chastisement, no reconstruction is possible in this country." End quote. With full legal sanction and the repressive apparatus of the state working in their favor, the opportunity to fulfill this promise was irresistible. Crucially, the king's escape from the country had been so sudden that hardly any of the primary culprits of the Legion's repression were able to follow suit. It was in this context that the Legionary police was founded on an ad hoc basis. They managed to apprehend several individuals, including George Arșesanu, Armand Călinescu's immediate successor as prime minister who presided over the reprisals following his assassination, Gabriel Marinescu, former police prefect of Bucharest, Ioan Bengliu, former inspector general of the gendarmerie who was directly responsible for Codreanu's execution, and Mikhail Morozov, the head of Kirill's secret police. These men, 64 in total, were held in Jalava prison and placed under heavy legionary guard to await trial. On September 23rd, Antonescu established a judicial commission to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of the Legion's repression. Sima pushed Antonescu to allow for an extraordinary tribunal, like Codreanu described, so that the Legion could ensure that the proper retribution was enacted. Antonescu denied this request, instead insisting on the due process of the law. The Legion would comply, at least for the time being. But, denied vengeance against the true architects of their misery, they redirected their rage towards their imagined persecutors, the Jews. Resolving the so-called Jewish question became a central priority of the National Legionary State, both for the Iron Guard and the military. This would be accomplished through the process of Romanianization, the systematic denaturalization and removal of the Jewish population, and the subsequent seizure and redistribution of their property to ethnic Romanians. For context, the analogous process in Germany was referred to as Aryanization. Antonescu began this process in the first week of his rule by reinstating the anti-Jewish legislation originally implemented by the Goga Cuza government in 1938. These laws, as you'll recall from the previous episode, effectively stripped a third of Romania's Jewish population of their citizenship. Building from this legal framework, Antonescu issued a series of additional decrees throughout the month of September, further depriving Jews of civil and political rights. Once Jews were segregated from the rest of Romanian society, the property confiscations began. On October 5th, a law was enacted prohibiting Jews from owning agricultural or industrial property. Said properties were to be seized by the state pending their redistribution to ethnic Romanians. Meanwhile, the Legion set about enacting Romanianization in their own way, and by that I mean engaging in a chaotic spree of robbery and extortion. This campaign was carried out by the Legionary police, the party's poorly organized and undisciplined paramilitary force. They had no official uniform, most preferring to wear leather jackets and cylindrical fur caps associated with haiduks, a type of outlaw figure common to Balkan history. Riding about on motorcycles, these policemen set out across the country, harassing Jews in the streets, robbing them of their personal effects, and arresting them on spurious pretexts, often for exhibiting immoral behavior in public. They extorted Jewish owners of homes and businesses for donations to a charitable organization established to aid Romanian refugees from the recently surrendered territories. Those who failed to pay up would have their property ransacked. In either case, the proceeds would end up directly in the pockets of individual legionaries. Later on, it became common for legionaries to force Jews to sell their property to them by means of coercion. The victims of these crimes largely kept silent. The ill-defined legal status of the organization left the state police powerless to intervene, nor could one expect much from the Gardist-dominated Ministry of the Interior. Attempting to report these legionary excesses was liable to result in being kidnapped, subjected to public humiliation, torture, or worse. Overall, the Legion behaved more like a gang of criminals than a ruling political party. Ad hoc Romanianization committees, established by newly appointed, or in some cases self-appointed, legionary civil servants, were supposed to provide these property seizures with legal backing, but in practice they were every bit as corrupt as the police were. Earlier, I mentioned that only a few hundred legionaries survived the Great Persecution, and the individuals who took their place were largely inexperienced and undisciplined. This problem became exponentially worse after the Legion ascended to power. Sima would later claim that 500,000 new members joined the Legion between September 1940 and the end of that year. This figure strains credulity, considering that the total membership of the organization was estimated at around 270,000 at the time of the 1937 election. Still, if we assume that the true number of new recruits was even a fraction of this figure cited by Sima, we can conclude that newcomers outnumbered veteran legionaries by a significant margin. Some of these people may have been genuine believers in the Legion's cause, but the majority were simple opportunists who only joined in the hopes of getting rich quickly by means of petty crime. This new generation of legionaries, derisively referred to by older members as Septembrists, were the men who formed the ranks of the legionary police and legionary civil service. Sima made some desultory efforts to curb the worst of the Septembrist excesses, for instance, placing limits on the maximum salary for public officials and implementing more stringent recruitment rules, although these were largely ineffective. Even if Sima were capable of reining in his followers, it's doubtful that he would have attempted. Bear in mind that Sima's control over the Legion was not uncontested. Zelea Codreanu was still capable of mounting a challenge to his leadership. Sima relied on the Septembrists for support, and in exchange he allowed them to enrich themselves to their heart's content. When approached by some older legionaries who asked him to put a stop to the pillaging, Sima responded simply, quote, "I can't. They wouldn't go for it." End quote. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. So, to recap, both principal factions of the National Legionary State pursued the objective of Romanianization, and they employed very different strategies to accomplish it. The Iron Guard went about dispossessing the Jews of their property in a decidedly unsystematic way, attacking and robbing at will, accountable to no one, with the only uniform element being, as Nagi Talavera remarks, the incredible amount of corruption. Their leader, Horia Sima, to varying degrees was unable and unwilling to impose any sort of restraint on his followers. By contrast, General Antonescu and his clique insisted on an orderly, legalistic process, dispossessing the Jews gradually through successive legal decrees. The Conjugator summarized his approach to Romanianization quite clearly in a statement given to an Italian newspaper on September 26, 1940. Quote, "I will solve the Jewish question through the process of organizing the state, slowly substituting Jews with Romanians, first and foremost with legionaries." End quote. I think it is worth stressing here that one should not mistake Antonescu's cautious approach for any sort of sympathy for the Jewish people. The final report of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania, released in 2004, emphasizes this point. Quote, "The confrontation between the Legion and Antonescu was not a confrontation between a gross, violent anti-Semitism and a compassionate, humane attitude, or between a savage form of nationalism and a more opportunistic form of anti-Semitism. Rather, the legionaries wanted everything, and they wanted it immediately. Antonescu, while sharing the same goal, intended to achieve it gradually through different methods." End quote. Still, it's worth considering what the different means that each of these factions used to achieve the same end can tell us about their respective political philosophies. Antonescu was a conservative in the strictest sense of the word. He was an austere military man who valued law, order, and discipline. This attitude stands in stark contrast to that of the legionaries who, without the moderating influence of Codreanu, were no longer restrained from acting on their most radical impulses. Closer analysis reveals that the differences between Antonescu and the Legion were more fundamental. There is a long-running historiographical debate as to whether Antonescu can be accurately described as a fascist, or if he was simply a traditionalist right-wing authoritarian who adopted certain aspects of fascism, what some historians would label as a para-fascist. This may seem like a meaningless distinction to make, especially considering Antonescu's willingness to collaborate with Nazi Germany and the Iron Guard, two groups whose fascist credentials are unimpeachable. However, I would argue that this is critical to understanding the events that would lead to the complete implosion of the National Legionary State. In the proclamation he made on the day of King Carol's abdication, Antonescu stated that he would govern according to principles which, quote, will emerge entirely from the creed of integral nationalism, end quote. Integral nationalism, a doctrine which originated with French arch-reactionary Charles Marat, is an anti-democratic counter-revolutionary doctrine more akin to absolutist monarchism than fascism. Antonescu's main focus was the salvation of the state, from which would proceed the redemption of the nation. He sought to secure and consolidate the interests of Romania's native middle and upper classes against ethnic minorities, peasants, and the working class. To establish this, he sought to enact the necessary changes from the top down, relying on institutions already well established in Romanian life, like the church and the military. The Legion's ideology, by contrast, had always possessed a certain revolutionary bent. Their goal was nothing short of the complete palingenetic rebirth of the nation, achieved by means of a revolutionary transformation of the social order. This would, of course, entail the overthrow and eradication of the nation's old political class, and their replacement by a new legionary elite, which itself would entail the creation of new institutions to replace existing power structures, and the indoctrination of a critical mass of the Romanian people. In essence, the Legion's ideology can be considered revolutionary, whereas Antonescu's was inherently conservative. Now, I do apologize for the lengthy tangent. It was not my original intention to get bogged down in a lengthy discussion about political science, but hopefully this information will help you better understand the narrative going forward. The first quarrel between Sima and Antonescu took place hardly a month into their partnership. In mid-October 1940, Sima wrote a letter to Antonescu in which he criticized the general for being overly tolerant of the old political parties. Antonescu, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, was on good terms with the leadership of the Liberal Party and the National Peasants' Party, and, to the extent that it still existed, the National Christian Party, or PNC. He had considered each of them as potential partners before settling on the Legion, and afterwards he had allowed them to continue operating on an informal basis, likely in the hopes that he might guide them into forming a broader nationalist coalition in the future. Sima and the Legion, on the other hand, categorically rejected any cooperation with other political parties, especially their avowed enemies in the PNC. In his letter, Sima insisted that there was no place in the new order for old political parties, and demanded that the general crack down on their activities. Quote, the legionary regime demands rule in the legionary spirit, totalitarian rule. Totalitarian rule means the political monopoly of a singular movement, the one that has prevailed. So it is in Germany, so it is in Italy. In Romania, there can be no toleration of any other party or faction. End quote. Antonescu's reply betrayed his frustration with the Legion's conduct. He wrote, in part, quote, I want what you want as well, but by other means and at a pace dictated by wisdom. We cannot demolish everything in a single day. We need a system. We need to preserve by our efforts. We need to demolish and rebuild bit by bit. As all these parts are linked together in a living organism, we have to carefully study each problem before taking action. End quote. Sima's bluff had been called. His next letter was conciliatory, reassuring the general that he intended to cooperate. What Sima was asking for to begin with, in practical terms, was for the Legion to be given greater control over the apparatus of state. Antonescu, witnessing the chaos caused by the Legion's lawless activities, was very disinclined to devolve any more power to them. The Legion was making it near impossible for Antonescu to carry out the gradual process of Romanianization that he sought to enact. Worse still, the disruption caused by the Legion's anarchic campaign of repossession was beginning to adversely impact the economy, at a time when the economy was already under intense stress. Taking into consideration everything else that was happening at the time, the withdrawal of foreign capital, the disruption of international trade during wartime, the recent loss of territory and the influx of refugees from said territories, and the plundering of the national treasury by Carol II, between all of these things, the economic situation was indeed rather dire. Food prices, for instance, rose by between 300 and 400% in a matter of just a few months, according to Nagy Talavera. But when Antonescu voiced his concerns about this state of affairs to Sima, he dismissed them out of hand, responding, quote, a legionary regime cannot coexist with a liberal economic structure. Herein lies the difficulty. Two concepts, two worlds, clash. End quote. Antonescu argued that things were more nuanced, that neither Germany nor Italy had fully transitioned to a planned economy, but Sima remained unconvinced. Witnessing legionaries accumulate ever-growing masses of wealth for themselves, Antonescu would eventually reach the conclusion that their motives were not the furtherance of the national project, but rather petty self-interest. In other words, to quote from the report of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania again, the general, quote, did not agree with the fact that individuals, rather than the Romanian nation at large, were benefiting from these actions. He became convinced that the Legion's actions were not serving the interests of Romanian nationalism, and that the Legion had become nothing more than an instrument of extortion for its own members. End quote. Then, on November 10th, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake, the second strongest in Romanian history, struck the country. The devastation was immense. Exact figures are disputed, but the most recent studies claim that nearly 600 were killed, over 1,200 seriously injured, and some 65,000 buildings were severely damaged in all. The epicenter was near the city of Focșani, and while most casualties were reported elsewhere in Moldavia, the effects were acutely felt in the densely populated capital city of Bucharest. There, a 14-story residential building called the Carlton Block completely collapsed, killing at least 140 of the building's 226 occupants. The Legion, to its credit, mobilized its members to assist with disaster relief efforts in the capital. However, these efforts were hampered by disorganization within the state bureaucracy. A few days after the earthquake, the simmering conflict between Horia Sima and Ion Zelea Codreanu finally boiled over into the open. The elder Codreanu, along with a group of supporters, marched on the Greenhouse, the Legion's headquarters in Bucharest. An angry exchange of words led to an exchange of gunfire, with the confrontation ending in the elder Codreanu and his supporters being detained and confined to house arrest. In reference to this incident, Antonescu privately stated that he could no longer tolerate living in this state of anarchy. He may have already resolved to move against his ostensible governing partners, but was hesitant to risk an open conflict at this juncture, as he was not yet certain where Romania's new allies, the Germans, stood. It was already clear that the Reich had an interest in the country's internal affairs, as evidenced by the fact that as early as October, they had deployed 15,000 German troops to guard the all-important oil refineries at Ploiesti in response to Antonescu's request for military assistance. If and when hostilities arose between the Iron Guard and the Romanian army, the disposition of these German forces would be critical to deciding the victor. Germany's ambassador to Romania, Wilhelm Fabricius, who had warmed to Antonescu over time, urged the general to meet with the Führer in person. Antonescu decided to do exactly that, and accordingly he made a diplomatic visit to Berlin in the latter half of November. The main item on the agenda, at least officially, was for Romania to sign the Tripartite Pact, the instrument that would formally bind Romania to the Axis powers in a military alliance. The Germans were especially keen to secure Romania's cooperation, as they had just begun drawing up plans for a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union, plans which Romania would certainly factor into one way or another. Antonescu had actually made an agreement with the Germans to sign the pact prior to his state visit. This was unbeknownst to his foreign minister, the staunchly pro-Legion Mihai Sturza. Sturza accompanied Antonescu on this trip, hoping perhaps to establish contacts for the Legion within the German government. However, Sturza would soon come to suspect that his presence on the trip was a mere formality. He would later remark in his memoirs, quote, "From our first moment in Berlin, I recognized that there was something going on between the general and his German interlocutors that the general did not want me to know about. This something could not have had anything to do with the possibility of hostilities with Soviet Russia, as I had always been present at these discussions." The visit to Berlin lasted 3 days in total, between November 21st and the 24th. During this time, Antonescu met with Germany's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, twice, and with Adolf Hitler at least once. On none of these occasions was Sturza allowed to sit in on these meetings, to his great chagrin. It's unknown what exactly was discussed during these secretive meetings. Antonescu would later claim that he had convinced Hitler to revise the Vienna Dictate, the agreement which ceded northern Transylvania to Hungary, in exchange for proactive Romanian participation in the war against the Soviet Union. Other sources maintained that Hitler was more non-committal than Antonescu suggested, offering only a vague reassurance that, quote, "the final chapter in the history of Transylvania is not yet written," end quote. Foreign Minister Sturza suspected that the something that Antonescu was so preoccupied with pertained to Romania's internal affairs. He claims that Ribbentrop, after one of his meetings with Antonescu, warned him, quote, "Do not ever get into a conflict with the army. Your movement would be annihilated," end quote. Antonescu almost certainly made reference to the troubles within his governing coalition, but it's unlikely he asked Hitler outright to support him against the Legion, as at this time he still believed it would be possible to wrest control over the movement from Sima. In any case, the conjugator evidently made a favorable impression on his German counterpart. The next day, at a luncheon at the Chancellery building, Hitler allegedly remarked to Sturza, unprompted, quote, "You do not know General Antonescu. You could not find a greater patriot to defend Romania's interests." End quote. This interaction was highly upsetting to the foreign minister, as it became clear to him then what Antonescu was playing at. He cut his itinerary short and departed Berlin in a huff that same day. Meanwhile, back in Romania, many legionaries conceived of the country's recent run of misfortunes, the earthquake being only the latest, to be the work of an angry god, punishing them for failing to properly honor their martyrs. Looking to rectify this, they carried out ceremonial reburials of fallen legionaries. These were elaborately staged public displays of ritual mourning, in keeping with the practice established with the funeral of the first two legionary martyrs, Ion Mota and Vasil Marin, in 1937. These proceedings typically involved a solemn procession, the singing of hymns, oath-taking, religious ceremonies, everything that one might expect. These ceremonial reburials began as early as September 12th, and from that time onward hardly a week passed without such a funeral. These events were so ubiquitous that Professor Constantin Ioardachi describes the period of legionary rule as, quote, "a perpetual festival of the dead," end quote. In total, 115 legionary martyrs were reburied in this manner, the greater part of them having been killed relatively recently, either fatalities of the abortive coup in September, or victims of the royal dictatorship's repression following the assassination of Prime Minister Călinescu in 1939. This program of reburials would culminate in the exhumation and reburial of Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu and his 13 companions, the members of the Decimviri and Nicodori. This was slated to occur on November 30th, the second anniversary of their deaths. For Horia Sima, the reburial of the captain was of paramount importance. Although Codreanu had been dead for almost 2 years now, his personality still loomed large over the movement. Take, for instance, the words of the young philosopher Emil Cioran, delivered in an address for the state radio, quote, "With the exception of Jesus Christ, no other dead being has been so present among the living. Has anyone forgot him? Has anyone even thought about forgetting him? This dead man spread a perfume of eternity over the dung of humanity, and brought back the sky over our nation." End quote. Anyone who aspired to lead the legionary movement could only hope to do so by associating themselves clearly with Codreanu. Sima, who had not been very close to the captain in his life, now sought to forge that association by facilitating his symbolic rebirth. And accordingly, plans for the commemoration of the 14 martyrs were carefully laid to make this the most spectacular, dramatic, and emotionally charged of all of these events. The proceedings would take place over the course of 5 days, beginning with the exhumation of their remains on November 25th, and ending with their final internment on the 30th. As the appointed time approached, there was a growing sense of anxiety among the legionaries that the men responsible for the deaths of the martyrs would not be brought to justice before they were laid to eternal rest. As you'll recall from earlier this episode, the legionary police arrested 64 individuals who they believed to be culpable for the repression of the movement during the royal dictatorship, including the murder of the 14 martyrs on November 30th, 1938. They were brought to Jalova prison and held there under legionary guard, awaiting trial. General Antonescu insisted that the prisoners receive due process and established a special judicial commission for this purpose, but the inquiry had progressed very slowly over the past 2 months, much to the legionaries' frustration. The opening date of the trial was continuously postponed. Sima warned Antonescu that if a satisfactory judgment was not enacted soon, he may be unable to restrain his colleagues from taking justice into their own hands. Hoping to avoid such an outcome, Antonescu planned to transfer the 64 prisoners from Jalova prison before the exhumation of Codreanu and the 13 other martyrs began, as their common grave was located directly outside the prison walls. Curiously, the legionary prefect of police, Stefan Zavoianu, delayed the transfer, providing some incidental excuse. Thus, the atmosphere was incredibly tense when teams of legionary workers began excavating the grave on November 26th. The inmates of Jalova, sensing the danger, frantically tried to contact Antonescu, pleading with him to send in troops from the regular army to replace the legionary guard. The workers became enraged upon learning of this, quickly reaching the conclusion that Antonescu intended to shield the prisoners from punishment. The captain of the worker corps, Dumitru Groza, gave a short impromptu speech calling on the men of the Iron Guard to avenge their captain. Groza ordered 20 men, all armed with handguns, to fall upon the prison and massacre the inmates to a man. The executions were carried out in a manner that can only be described as excessively violent. Each victim was shot at least twice. The unfortunate former chief of secret police, Mikhail Morozov, was shot 38 times. A subsequent investigation found that no fewer than 579 bullets were fired in a span of just 15 minutes. Many of the bodies were further mutilated with hammers and axes for good measure. Upon fulfilling this act of sacred wrath, the executioners reassembled at the grave, proclaiming, quote, "Captain, we have avenged you," end quote. General Antonescu was positively furious when news of the Jalava massacre reached him the next morning. He immediately convened a meeting of the Council of Ministers, during which he made no secret of his feelings. He declared, quote, "The handful of reprobates who committed this crime will be punished in an exemplary manner. I will not allow the future of this nation to be compromised by a band of terrorists," end quote. These killings were not, he argued, acts of legitimate vengeance, but outright criminality, exactly the sort of thing that he refused to tolerate. He categorically denounced the massacre and demanded that the Legion's leadership follow suit and issue a public communiqué to their members disavowing the actions of the killers. Sima and the other Guardist ministers denied having any prior knowledge of the plot, and going a step further, arguing that no plot existed. They attempted to exculpate their fellow legionaries by arguing that the massacre was simply a crime of passion. They claimed that the sight of the exhumed corpses of their heroes, thrown callously into a common pit, their faces horrifically disfigured from the gallons of sulfuric acid poured on top of them after the fact, that this sight inspired such intense feelings of grief and rage that a massacre was inevitable. Sima restated this view decades later in his memoir, writing, quote, "The punishment of the Jalava criminals was not a premeditated action. Legionaries who, in normal circumstances, would not have been capable of the slightest act of brutality took part in it," end quote. The others present at this cabinet meeting found this version of events unconvincing. General Nicolae Maresh, the Minister of Agriculture, wrote a summary of the meeting in which he stated, quote, "The general impression of the non-legionary ministers, myself included, was that all the legionary ministers, together with General Petroviescu, were well informed of the plans and are morally responsible for the massacre," end quote. This view, that the murder of the prisoners at Jalava was carefully planned and coordinated, is shared by most historians. Ultimately, the legionary ministers were cajoled into co-signing an official statement by the Council of Ministers repudiating the massacre and promising severe consequences for the perpetrators and all others who acted in opposition to the principles of legality and justice on which the new order was founded. Sima even issued an additional statement in his capacity as commander of the Legion, appealing to the legionaries to, quote, "follow the example of the captain," end quote, and strictly observe order and discipline. These warnings had little effect. The Legion's lust for revenge remained yet unsatiated, as that very same day, a legionary death team led by one Traian Boieru carried out 2 further high-profile assassinations. The victims were Nicolae Iorga and Virgil Madgiaru, whose bullet-riddled corpses were discovered in a forest outside Bucharest on the morning of November 28th. Supposedly, they were targeted for their involvement in intrigues against the Legion during the royal dictatorship. This accusation was certainly true in Iorga's case. If you'll recall from the previous episode, the 70-year-old historian had played a very public role in the prosecution, conviction, and, by extension, the murder of Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu. In his book, The Suicide of Europe, Mihai Sturza decried the assassination of Iorga as, quote, "an act of wanton violence that seemed precisely calculated to do as much harm as possible to the Legion and to provoke the indignation of Romanian and European opinion writ large," end quote. Yet, hardly a paragraph later, Sturza writes, quote, "Of all the scores of publicists, newspapermen, and columnists who could have been indicted for their constant, mendacious, and perverted activities in assisting the murderers of Codreanu with their pen, the most capricious would have been Nicolae Iorga. Without his complicity, neither Carol nor Calinescu would have dared to go against the captain. It was not simply the removal of Codreanu from Romania's political life that Iorga desired, it was his death. It was Iorga who provided the Camarilla with the pretext for the arrest of Codreanu. It was Iorga who contrived the necessary measures to prevent the victim from escaping the clutches of his kidnappers. It was Iorga again, alone among the heads of the political parties, who helped to promote the false idea of a legionary conspiracy, a lie that eventually brought the captain to the jail cell, from which there was no exit but to his grave." End quote. So, while killing Iorga, possibly the most revered Romanian academic of his time, drew widespread condemnation at home and abroad, there was at least a clear motive behind this crime. The case of the other notable victim of that day, Virgil Maghiaru, is not nearly as clear-cut. Maghiaru was an economist and a statesman. He was a prominent figure in the National Peasants' Party, and at the time of his death he was the acting general secretary of the party. Unlike Iorga, and many other members of his party, Maghiaru had refused to serve in Carol II's government, thus making it difficult to believe that he was responsible in any way for the Legion's persecution. I should note, however, that several other politicians were targeted by legionary death squads for assassination immediately after the Jelava massacre, including former Prime Ministers George Tatarescu and Ion Gigurtu. Both men actually helped the Legion while in office, albeit indirectly, which probably explains why Sima intervened to save them from sharing the fate of Iorga and Maghiaru. The Jelava massacre and subsequent assassinations of Nicolae Iorga and Virgil Maghiaru pushed the already strained relationship between General Antonescu and the Legion all the more closer to the breaking point. To Antonescu, these events demonstrated clearly that the Legion was incapable of governing responsibly. One way or another, something had to be done, but what recourse did he have? During a cabinet meeting, the general demanded that Sima cede leadership over the Legion to himself. There could not, he argued, be two separate authorities within one state. He cited the example of Francisco Franco's successful co-opting of the Falangist movement in Spain. Sima refused to even consider the possibility, replying that the legionary movement would simply not obey an outsider like Antonescu. The two argued back and forth in this manner for quite some time, before a German diplomat named Hermann Neubacher intervened, telling Antonescu, quote, "These things should not be taken so tragically. Revenge is the natural order of the day when radical political changes occur, and you should be able to understand the situation." End quote. Neubacher's mediation worked, insofar as it persuaded Antonescu to drop the issue for the time being. But after this interaction, Antonescu came to the same realization that Carol II had vis-à-vis the Legion. He could not hope to control them, so it was necessary to eliminate them. He may well have wished to destroy them at that very moment, but the time was not yet right. He could not risk an open conflict without receiving assurance of German support, and, moreover, he thought it prudent to wait until after the much-anticipated reburials of the martyrs took place on November 30th. Unfortunately, we will have to bookmark our narrative here for the time being. In the next episode, we will pick up where we left off with the aforementioned funeral proceedings, and then move on to the events of January 1941. With the partnership between General Antonescu and the Iron Guard fraying at the seams, some kind of rupture within the coalition was inevitable. But how would the divorce play out? Which side would the Germans support? Who would come out on top? And who would be relegated to the dustbin of history? All of these questions and more will be answered in the next and final episode of this series on the Iron Guard. Again, to restate what I said at the top of the show, that episode should be released tomorrow with any luck. As always, questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address can be directed to the show's email address, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Additional information can be found on the show's website. A link will be available in the episode description. If you like the show and want to help keep it going for the foreseeable future, please consider leaving a review for it on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use, or consider purchasing some used books from my eBay page. A link will be in the episode description as well. In any event, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.